Welcome, everyone, to this episode of the All Things Marilyn Podcast. My name is Scott Fortner, Marilyn Monroe historian, collector, and owner of the Marilyn Monroe Collection.
And I'm Elisa Jordan. I'm an author, founder of LA Woman Tours, and I'm also a Marilyn Monroe historian.
This is our third season, and this is episode 3. And we have with us again Mr. David Stenn. So for our viewers who might not be familiar with Mr. Stenn, he's an American television writer, producer, biographer, and film preservationist. His television credits include Untold Hollywood, Boardwalk Empire, Girl 27, The L Word, 21 Jump Street, Hill Street Blues, and Beverly Hills 90210. He's known for his biographies of Hollywood stars Clara and Jean Harlow, and he's also a huge fan of Marilyn. So David was our guest on our last podcast where we talked about how he dove in deep to learn more about how Gladys came up with Marilyn's birth name, Norma Jeane. So be sure to listen to our last podcast if you'd like to hear more about that. Elisa, what's David going to talk about today?
This is an especially difficult topic to listen to because we learn about Erin Frosch, who was Marilyn's attorney when she was alive and then continued to manage her estate after she passed away. And we learn about the mismanagement of her estate, what that meant for the people who were named in her will, and what it meant to Marilyn herself because her wishes weren't followed. I don't want to be dramatic, but it was really hard to hear some of this information.
It was negligence.
Yeah.
There was a lot of mismanagement of Marilyn's estate, and David goes into detail in this interview about how Marilyn was cash poor but asset rich. And she had a lot of income that was coming in as residuals from her films. The estate was just very poorly mismanaged, and there were lots of missed opportunities, and her wishes were not granted in the way that she had wanted them. And David is the one who published this in an article that was in the September-October 1982 issue of Film Comment magazine.
Now, the good news, and we will tell you there is a happy ending, but it's not thanks to Erin Frosch. It's thanks to David Stenn and the work he did and what he uncovered.
So shall we get into it?
Let's get into it.
If I am a star, the people made me a star.
Marilyn Monroe.
Like the stage here and now, fame is fickle.
Marilyn Monroe.
I give you the two most exciting words in the modern dictionary. Marilyn Monroe!
David, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm great, and I'm thrilled to be here.
David, thank you so much for coming back. We're happy to have you again. Tell us how you got into Marilyn.
I think of Marilyn Monroe as the gateway drug into the love of movies because so many people, including myself, fell in love with her, and that's how we fell in love with films. I saw the first Marilyn Monroe movie when I was 5 years old because this teenager who was our babysitter had a magazine about her, and I started reading the magazine, and she would read it to us as if it were like a fairy tale. This was only 5 years after she had died, so think about that. It's 2025. As someone who would have passed away in 2020, it was very recent, so it felt much more real. It didn't feel like it was in the past. From that, I just started loving old films and being interested in them and being interested in the history of them. And I read obsessively any book I could. And back in those days, what you read, you could not believe. The reason was because it wasn't true most of the time. And there was no standard for writing about Hollywood historically. It was frustrating, but I just read everything I could anyway. And then when I was in college, I got an internship at Film Comment for the summer. And that was a thrill to me because I was around all of these people, and it was New York, and they had Buster Keaton festivals, and I could see all of these movies. But it was also the summer that was the 20th anniversary of Marilyn Monroe's death. Norman Mailer's book had already come out, and I had a strong moral objection to that book. But for the most part, there was no such thing as merchandising as we know it today. There was no such thing as an ancillary market for films. Video cassettes were just becoming something. And here I am in New York City in the summer, and I'm seeing this inundation of Marilyn Monroe ashtrays, bracelets, buttons, cocktail holders, jigsaw puzzles, life-size posters, matches, napkin holders, greeting cards, postcards, statues, T-shirts, shopping bags, paper dolls. And I just thought, where does this money go? Because Marilyn Monroe isn't alive, and she didn't have a husband, and she didn't have children when she died. So who's getting all this money? Because someone's getting rich off Marilyn Monroe. And it was just a question I wondered about. And I went down to the New York Surrogates Court. I requested her probate file. It was the first probate file I'd ever seen. And they brought it out. It was all musty and dusty. I must have been the first person to go through it since she had died. And I didn't understand it because I wasn't a lawyer, but also because it didn't make sense to me. And that led me down this road of researching what originally was just to answer a simple question. Where does the money go? Where is this revenue stream going? But what it ended up uncovering was 2 decades of gross mismanagement by her attorney, who was also the executor and trustee of her estate.
You actually ended up talking to Aaron Frosch and interviewing him. Can we just clarify for our listeners who may not know, who was he?
Aaron Frosch was Marilyn Monroe's attorney. In January 1961, following her divorce from Arthur Miller, she drew up a new will. And in the will, she left very specific bequests for her loved ones. She left $10,000 to her sister, Bernice Miracle, and her secretary. She left $5,000 to her close friends, Norma and Hedda Ralston, which was earmarked specifically for the education of their daughter, Patricia Ralston. She left her personal effects and clothing to Lee Strasberg to distribute among her friends. And she left a $100,000 trust fund for her mother, which was meant to pay Gladys Baker $5,000 a year. And she also left a bequest of $2,500 per year to the wife of her first drama coach, Michael Chekhov. And the remainder of her estate, she left to her psychotherapist, Dr. Marianne Criss, but she didn't leave it to her directly. She left it to her with the requirement that Dr. Criss donate her share of the inheritance to the psychiatric institution of her choice. So these are really specific quests. They are thoughtful, they're intentional, and they're kind and loving. And what I discovered reviewing this file was none of this happened. And the estate only filed a final accounting in 1980, 18 years after Marilyn Monroe had died, and 12 years after Patricia Ralston had graduated college, and 6 years after Mrs. Michael Chekhov had died. I couldn't even get to the place of being shocked because I felt so unqualified. And my father was an attorney, not an estate attorney, but an attorney. And he lived in Chicago. So I would call him up, like I would work all day and then I would research this at night and I would call him up and I would read him some document. And he would say to me, no, that's wrong. And I would say, no, I'm reading you what it says. And he said, you can't be. And I would say, but I am. And he would say, and finally he said, you should really talk to someone about this because I'm not qualified, but it sounds like there's gross mismanagement here. So that's when I showed it all to an attorney. And he said, you need to get in touch with the attorney for Dr. Criss. And I did. And he said, yes, we are reviewing the same thing because Aaron Frosch told us when Marilyn Monroe died that her estate was bankrupt.
And it wasn't?
Yes. And when Dr. Criss died, she never even mentioned it because she thought there's no value to it. There was never any revenue stream. There was never any money coming to it. So I had to almost autopsy exactly what had happened. And because I was just this teenage college student, everyone would talk to me because nobody took me seriously enough to be any kind of threat. So I called Aaron Frosch and I asked to talk to him. And he said, sure, come to my office. And for about an hour, he pontificated about what a wonderful attorney he was and how good he was to Marilyn Monroe and how much she cared about him. And I had to sit there with this poker face thinking, I don't think so.
Were there any specific things that you can remember that really set off the alarm bells and set off your father's alarm bells?
Well, the alarm bells were a lack of distribution of assets. If you leave bequests to people and those people don't get their money, Gladys, her mother, didn't get her $5,000 annual payment until 1976. So what should have happened, for example, is while she was waiting to get those payments, that money should have been set aside in some sort of trust so that it could accrue interest and earn money for her. But Aaron Frosch did none of that. Meanwhile, he paid himself a commission twice without going to court to get it approved. You're not allowed to do that. When someone
Wow.
passes away and their estate is probated, the court has to approve everything because the client is dead. So the court has to approve everything to protect the client. Even I, as a teenager, understood something is very wrong when someone leaves a will and says, I want this much to go to this person and this to go to this person, and none of it gets done. Or it gets done so late, it makes you wonder what has been going on. And also, I knew from the will that Marilyn Monroe had a 10% gross, not net, gross profit interest in both Some Like It Hot and The Misfits.
So let's talk about that just real quick, David. A lot of people think that when she died, she was actually broke. And in your article, you say she was cash poor, but asset rich. So talk about the assets, just so it's clear.
Well, thanks, Scott, because that's really the fundamental important point here. And like you said, it's what has led to so many misconceptions about Marilyn Monroe's financial state. She died cash poor and asset rich, but it was deliberate because what she had done is defer payments from both Some Like It Hot and The Misfits annually over a period of years because it saved in taxes. But then she died. So suddenly you're not able to take tax deductions. Once you're dead, they're subject to federal tax, New York state tax, because when she died, she was considered a New York state resident, which is why her will was filed there. And California, because that's where she was working. And then agent commissions, motion picture relief fund deductions, and all of these payroll taxes, because she was a business person. She had a company, Marilyn Monroe Productions. She had plenty of money coming in the future, but when she died, she did not have enough assets to cover her debts because when she died, for example, there was a $500,000 lawsuit against her from Fox that was still pending when she died. They ended up dropping it. But when the will was filed, that was considered a debt because that was a pending lawsuit against her. So Aaron Frosch, instead of saying, all right, there's all this money that's going to come in, I have to protect it and get ready for it, he told everyone she was bankrupt. And that led to this myth of, oh, she died with no money. But owning 10% of the gross, meaning right from the top, before deductions, everybody that goes in to see Some Like It Hot, or every amount that it's paid for the subsequent ancillary markets like video cassettes and now streaming or whatever, 10% of that goes to her. Same with the Misfits. For example, by 1962, when she died, she had already made $336,000 from the Misfits, which is about almost $4 million today. But she hadn't received the payments.
That's really fascinating. And of course, with inflation, as you said, millions of dollars today.
That's right. I came into the picture where suddenly merchandising is happening and suddenly there's all sorts of new revenue streams that no one had ever anticipated. Your image likeness. Other families at the time were already active in this. W.C. Fields' family, obviously Elvis's family, Abbott and Costello. Their descendants had already hired people whose job was to market and merchandise them and protect against piracy. And nobody was doing that for Marilyn Monroe, which is ironic because nobody was getting more merchandising than Marilyn.
So you're sitting in Aaron Frosch's office. Do you have more than one meeting? Is this the first meeting? Do you just listen to him pontificate? How does it go? And how do you finally confront him?
There was only one meeting, and one was more than enough because it really was enraging to sit there and pretend like he was who he claimed he was. Because by the time I saw him, I knew what the truth was because I had all the documentation. So it was less about me grilling him where I would have just been thrown out of the office and more about me just wanting to hear his version of events and his side and what he thought. And there were a couple of places where I said, well, for example, you sold the distribution rights to The Prince and the Showgirl, which Warner's did not own. Marilyn Monroe Productions and Laurence Olivier Productions shared the rights to The Prince and the Showgirl. Warner Brothers licensed it for a term period, which expired in 1965. Aaron Frosch did nothing with it, nothing. And then in 1970, he sold those shares to Warner Brothers because he said there was no revenue to be made from that movie. So I said to him, I'm confused. Why did you decide not to do anything with Prince and the Showgirl when the rights reverted back to the Marilyn Monroe estate in 1965 and then you sold it? And he treated me with such condescension, which I understood. I was a college kid. Why should he look up to me? But he was trying to explain to me why his decision to do that was so smart, because there was no real interest in it and what could he do with it. But there were other instances that I did not say to him because I thought this is just too inflammatory. For example, and Scott, as a collector, this will make steam come out of your ears. But in 1972, Tom Kelly, the photographer, petitioned for the transparencies of his 1949 nude photographs of Marilyn Monroe because, according to his petition, she borrowed them in 1952 to show Joe DiMaggio and didn't return them. So Tom Kelly filed a petition with the court. And in his response, in his answering affidavit, Aaron Frosch testified that Marilyn Monroe purchased these transparencies, which featured unretouched shots unseen by the public. But, and this is a quote, he said to the court, "I am informed they have little value in today's photography market," end quote. So he did nothing with them. By the time somebody else came in to try and do something with these on behalf of Marilyn Monroe's estate, the Ektachrome images had faded beyond recognition.
Wow.
So as a human being, plus a film preservationist, it's a double crime, right? He's
Right.
treating Marilyn Monroe terribly, but he's also letting these unique, unretouched images of Marilyn Monroe before she was famous disappear.
So I have a burning question. He was her attorney while she was alive. She was his client. So why would he mismanage her estate so significantly?
That's a really good question. And not only was he her attorney, but he was Elizabeth Taylor's attorney. He was a really prominent attorney. And that's why at the beginning of this whole journey, I always think it's healthy to doubt yourself because it keeps you on your toes. If you get too smug or too sure of yourself, you're going to miss something. I would say, David, what do you know? You don't know anything. And he's a prominent attorney. But to answer your question, I feel like he was the wrong person to do this. When he drew her will up, he should have said to her, "Don't make me your executor and trustee. You need to work with a probate attorney. I am going to hook you up with this person who specializes in this," because it's not what he did. He represented living people. He was not a trust and estates attorney. And that's what people do who want to write a will. When they have significant money and they're celebrities, they go to a trust and estates attorney because that's a specialist.
Yeah.
And I don't think he was interested in advocating on behalf of a decedent.
Yeah.
Once she was gone, he wasn't interested in doing that. And rather than farm it out to someone who was or could, he just did nothing. And it was almost a perfect storm of how an estate can get so mismanaged, because besides all of that, there was no family member to advocate for her. Bernice was in Kentucky and then in Florida. Gladys was in Florida and was declared incompetent. There was no one to call up Aaron Frosch and say, "Hey, I'm reading this document and the rights to The Prince and the Showgirl expired this year. What's going to happen with it? What are you doing with it? Have you called Warner Brothers? Have you called MGM? Have you called anyone? Can we get a TV deal?" There was nobody pressuring him. Patricia Roston, she's about to enter college. Why hasn't she received her college funding? Wait a minute, Mrs. Chekhov died. She never got her money. And the biggest crime to me was Dr. Chris, because Dr. Chris had chosen the Anna Freud Children's Clinic in London as the institution which would receive the bulk of Marilyn Monroe's estate's proceeds, and these children weren't getting it.
Yeah.
We all know how much Marilyn Monroe loved children. We all know how devastated she was that she couldn't have children. So her last will and testament, she did something for children that was beautiful and giving and loving.
Yeah.
Her last wish was not being fulfilled.
I was wondering, you have this meeting with Aaron, you leave. When does he find out that you know the truth?
He found out when he read the story.
So tell us how that got published.
Film Comment was a sort of intellectual film journal for really serious cinephiles, and it had writers I really admired, but it did not do investigative pieces. I went into the editor, Richard Corliss, who also did all the film reviews for Time magazine, and I pitched this to him and I said, I think I'm onto something, and here's what I found. What should I do with it? And it was the 20th anniversary of Marilyn Monroe's passing. They were planning on doing something, but it was much more of a critical piece, a career appreciation, her impact, the fact that she was still so popular. And he said, we're going to run this. I was thrilled beyond words because, like I said, I had read film comments since I was a kid. Well, I still was a kid, but they ran it and Aaron Frosch saw it and he wrote me a letter, which was essentially a "you'll never work in this town" letter. You'll never work in this town again. But I was a college student, so I didn't work in the town anyway. So him saying I'll never work in this town again was kind of an empty threat. And I was right nonetheless. But everyone around me said, he can't do anything because everything you printed is documented truth. You're quoting from legal files. There's no quote in that article, which you can find on my Instagram account. It's in my bio if you want to read the piece itself. There's no quote from anyone in there except Aaron Frosch. This isn't hearsay. It's not secondary evidence. It's all documented. I think he was trying to scare me, but he couldn't do much else.
What's the aftermath? The article comes out. Aaron Frosch is not happy, but his mismanagement is exposed. Were there consequences? What happens next?
There were major consequences. Time magazine covered it. The article got enormous coverage because people were outraged and amazed that this had all gone on. And Dr. Chris's estate was completely thrilled because it bolstered their case that they were trying to pursue, because they'd been trying to get an accounting from Aaron Frosch. He wouldn't cooperate. And attorneys representing Gladys Baker, Marilyn Monroe's mother, and Mrs. Chekhov joined in this crusade, and they all agreed to hire a merchandiser. His name was Roger Richmond. He was very popular at the time. He represented the estates of W.C. Fields and Carole Lombard and Clark Gable and Abbott and Costello. And he started merchandising legally. So he would send cease and desist letters to people who were illegally merchandising products. And I was constantly sending him products. I would buy them and then I would send them to him and say, did you know about this? And he'd find out who was doing it and he would go after them. So the estate started making enormous amounts of money, which they should have been making all along. But now they were making it. The court took it over and the estate started to be properly managed.
Do you remember about what year that was?
That all would have been in 1982. It all happened very quickly. I did this over a summer, and then by September, October, this was all in place. Roger Richmond was hired in 1982 because I remember speaking to him and saying, I have all of this research if you need it for anything. The other thing that was amazing, Marilyn Monroe's mother was still alive. People didn't even think about it. So I spoke to her lawyer. He was down in Tallahassee, and I was telling him about it because Gladys was alive and could use the money. Same with Bernice. This was her family, her only family.
Getting nothing, or very delayed benefits.
Very delayed. And like I said before, if he had put that money and invested it on behalf of Gladys, her trust was not funded until, I believe, 1976. It's in the article. So that's 14 years.
Yeah. So, David, I spent quite a bit of time with Anna Strasberg, and I remember one time she was talking about Aaron Frosch, and if I remember correctly, the words that she used were, he's a snake. Did she ever mention Aaron Frosch to you?
I never talked about it with her because when I did this article, like I said, I was in college. So I did speak to her briefly, but I don't think at the time, he was a really prominent attorney. And I don't think people wanted to publicly go against him. I was the ideal person to do this because I had nothing to lose and I didn't know any better. I had no career. I had nothing at stake. But at the time, to go up against Elizabeth Taylor's attorney and the person that Marilyn Monroe had entrusted with her estate, it was like David and Goliath.
I remember in conversations with Anna, she told me that Lee and Anna, and for people listening who may not know, Anna Strasberg was Lee's wife at the time, his third wife, who didn't really know Marilyn in the professional capacity, though she shared with me she did meet her one time in passing when Anna was very young and working at the United Nations, and she didn't even know Lee at the time. But Anna shared that they didn't even get Marilyn's personal effects and belongings until, I believe, sometime in the 80s, if I remember correctly. So that's 20 years or so after she passed away. I think that's just probably a testament to how long it actually did take to settle the estate and go through all of the process. But she said it was quite some time after she'd passed away.
I'm glad you brought that up, Scott, because in the article, I'm just going to read this little line. It says, instead of distributing Marilyn Monroe's property with proper expedients, Frosch incurred storage charges of $16,384 between 1962 and 1972, even though the possessions only had a tax value of only $11,057. So
Right.
he's not doing anything and he's losing money.
Right.
And Marilyn's estate had to pay for that rental fee, right?
Correct.
So they're paying more in rental fee than it's worth.
Yes. Not only are they paying more than the actual property is worth, but like you said, Scott, they're not distributing the property. That's their job.
Right.
That's what her will says. Give it
Right.
to the Strasburgs,
Right.
and they will decide what to do with it.
I do also want to point out, I spent quite a bit of time with Anna Strasberg. Of course, she's passed away now. There were many visits to her home in New York, and she shared with me her and Lee, they did make attempts to distribute Marilyn's belongings amongst her friends per Marilyn's wishes. And they actually did give items to people. But the issue I think that people sometimes don't really pay attention to is, number one, it was quite some time before the Strasbergs even came to possess the belongings. And number two, a lot of the people, they didn't know how to contact, or those people weren't even around anymore. And there was so much of Marilyn's estate. To give it all away, I think, would have really been a task. Anna said that being the executor or the owner of Marilyn's estate was both a privilege and a burden. It wasn't something that was simple or easy. And they did make attempts to give stuff away, and they actually did give pieces away.
That's a great point, because in general, being an executor is not an easy job. You have to do a lot. And that's why they usually let attorneys do it, because you have to be familiar with the court system. But also, if someone says, I want this piece to go to this person, or I want this to go to this person, it's your job to make sure that happens. And that can be time consuming and difficult. And like you said, in 1982, it's almost hard to evoke how different it was. There were already so many books about Marilyn Monroe written, and nobody talked about Bernice, her sister. Nobody talked about the fact that her mother was still alive. And Marilyn Monroe always spoke about her mother in the past tense, but she was alive.
Mhm.
Gladys was still alive. She was a person, and she was an old person who needed to be protected. And that's what her daughter wanted. Her daughter had supported her throughout her life. To me, as a young person at the time, I had grandparents. The idea of not protecting an older person and not giving them the money that their daughter had wanted them to have, just so that they never had to worry about money and could get good care, it's sinful.
Was this negligent behavior on the part of Aaron Frosch?
I believe it was. And I believe if they had prosecuted him, they would have had ample evidence of that. It was gross abuse of his position as executor and trustee of the estate of Marilyn Monroe.
Why do you think no one took him to court?
Well, I think it was 2 decades later, and there was nobody representing the family. Bernice didn't have the money to do that. Gladys was in no condition to do that. So who actually sues? There could have been a disciplinary hearing, and maybe they should have done that. In terms of the actual lawyers that I spoke to representing Dr. Chris and Gladys and Mrs. Chekhov, they just wanted to get what was due to their client and move on. They didn't want to get in a battle with Aaron Frosch and bring him down. They just wanted to seek justice on behalf of their clients, and that was their job. Their job wasn't to advocate for Marilyn Monroe. Their job was to advocate for their clients. And that all happened. I was really impressed with all of them. They all seemed like really legitimate, honest people.
You know what irritates me the most about this is Gladys was in a private sanitarium at the time of Marilyn's death, which Marilyn was paying for. And Marilyn put Inez Melson in charge of her mother. Inez worked for Marilyn. And after Marilyn's death, the estate was behind in paying for Gladys's care. The sanitarium, Rockhaven, could have asked her to leave. They didn't. And eventually the debt was paid off a couple of years later. But I guess it was Aaron Frosch, whoever was managing the estate, wasn't taking care of Marilyn's mother. And we're talking about a roof over the woman's head. We're not talking about anything extravagant. This was the place where they were taking care of a woman who was vulnerable and ill. And fortunately, Rockhaven took mercy on her and the family and waited for the debt to be paid. But there could have been devastating consequences for her. And Aaron Frosch was at the center of that and never took responsibility.
It's so awful. And you have to understand that the will stipulated that she get $5,000 a year. Gladys, $5,000 a year from a $100,000 trust. Since he didn't fund the trust until December of 1976, which is 14 years after Marilyn Monroe died, Gladys should have been entitled to interest from income and or the principal of that $5,000 a year, which means in 1976, he shouldn't have just started giving her her annual $5,000 payment. He owed her $70,000.
Wow.
And she never got it. And he told me that he made those payments. And I said to him, do you have records of that? And he could not produce them.
Wow.
That's really shocking.
It's disgraceful.
Yeah.
And if I had been an attorney, I would have gone after him just because that's my personality. I did the best I could to go after him. I certainly disgraced him right back.
For sure.
And the article, like I said, impacted the estate and it got things in order again.
Mm-hmm.
In going through some of the paperwork after Marilyn's death, I remember seeing some of Inez Milson's communication, and I'm paraphrasing, I don't remember it exactly, but just something like, hey, can we keep an eye on this guy? Hey, something's off. Just, she couldn't put her finger on it. She couldn't accuse him of anything, but she sensed something was off and no one took her seriously.
Wow.
Well, I think, as David said, if he was such a prominent, well-known, quote unquote, respected attorney at the time, who's going to pay any attention to it, you know? And I probably feel it's important to point out that Inez herself didn't necessarily have clean hands in regards to Marilyn's estate, because she did a couple of things as well. Not to this level, but she wasn't included in the will. And she kept a couple of items for herself from Marilyn's estate. The Happy Birthday, Mr. President dress, the green Norman Norell dress that Marilyn wore to the 1962 Golden Globes, the Rodin statue, the beaver coat, all of those things, the Strasburgs had to sue her to get.
Wow. When would that have been?
I don't know the exact dates. I've seen the paperwork. It's my opinion that Inez had been with Marilyn for such a long time because she was her business manager in the early 50s. So it wasn't just when she passed away. She was with Marilyn for a good 10 years, probably. And Marilyn didn't include her in the final will. So I think Inez just said, well, I'm just going to keep this stuff. And unfortunately, she took really high profile, well-known items. The Happy Birthday, Mr. President dress, of course. And there are photos of Inez's sister wearing the green dress that Marilyn wore to the 1962 Golden Globes.
It was negligence. It wasn't like he was sitting there thinking, how can I rip off this estate? I think he wasn't interested in acting as an estate attorney. But I blame him for that because, like I said before, he should have referred her. Right. And then after she passed away, he should have referred the case. He could have gone to court and said, because attorneys do this all the time, and said, I'm recusing myself from this estate probate case. I would like the court to appoint this attorney who specializes in probate. And that person would have done the job. I don't think Aaron Frosch was interested. And so he just did nothing.
Obviously. Well, I think it's really clear, David, that you were the one that got the process started here and really surfacing the lack of management of Marilyn's estate and giving people the ammunition they needed to go in and take action.
I hope so. It was an incredible experience for me because I felt so fortunate to embark on this quest and have it produce results. And it really imprinted on me because I thought from that very early age, you know, if you do the research and you find things, you can get what you need and affect change. And so all my work from then on involved just rigorous research because I felt like it can produce tangible results. Like even some kid can make a difference. That was a really fundamental and important lesson in my life.
Well, thank you for doing that.
It's like Marilyn Monroe gave me something. That's how I feel. I thank her.
Do you think this has had any long-lasting effects on how celebrities set up their estates for the future? Do you think they've looked back on this, or the attorneys have looked back on this, and there are now safety precautions they can put into paperwork to prevent something like this from happening again?
I wish I could say yes, but I don't think so. I think it's human nature to not want to think about your own mortality. And there are so many people that don't have wills. Everyone should have a will because you just never know what can happen. And I worked on another quest of mine about 20 years ago where the Jeane Harlow family had inherited 7 figures that had been sitting since the 1950s, but the woman that was inheriting it from Jeane Harlow's mother never had a will. And so so she never thought she was rich in her own lifetime because she didn't know about it, but she was. So Prince died intestate, which means without a will.
And that was just a few years ago.
But in Marilyn Monroe's case, she had a will, and her will was really specific. And the problem is, if you're a single woman with no dependents, who is going to advocate for you? And that was, I think, why she became so vulnerable as a victim in this situation. If only Bernice had lived in New York or California or had the funds to follow this, it might have made a difference. Or like you said, Elisa, if she had taken her suspicions to someone. But who knows? It's theoretical. We can't tell. But I think these stories seem to happen too frequently, and I don't think it necessarily makes a difference.
This has been a fascinating story, yet another layer of intrigue around Marilyn and another aspect of her story after she's passed, and an unfortunate one. So, David, we really appreciate you being here.
Yeah, this was fascinating.
Thank you. And I feel like there is a happy ending here because this children's clinic now gets money and has for the last 40 years. Marilyn Monroe's last wishes are being granted.
That's nice to know.
It is a good outcome. David, thank you again. How can our listeners follow you online?
I am on Instagram at Real David Stenn, and the actual article, Marilyn Inc., that this whole podcast episode has been about is in my bio.
And I'll post a link to that article as part of the podcast. Either go to David Stenn's bio on Instagram and read the article, or just click on the link in the podcast. It'll all go to the same place. Again, it's the October 1982 issue of Film Comment magazine. David, thank you again. It's been a pleasure, and we hope to have you back.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the All Things Marilyn podcast. We hope that you enjoy listening as much as we enjoy developing and distributing this information. If you like what you've heard today, please leave us a positive comment or a positive rating anywhere that you listen to podcasts. You can follow us online at All Things Marilyn Podcast on Instagram. And you can certainly send us an email with any feedback or suggestions for future podcasts. And we can be reached at allthingsmarilynpodcast@gmail.com. We'll see you next time on All Things Marilyn.
Good night, man.
Bye-bye.
You loved on the screen, and that's the one thing that survived, you know.
I realize more and more the responsibility, but you do miss sometimes just being able to be completely yourself and someplace, and people just know you as another human being.